Okay, worrying about AI, where did it all begin? Um, this was a product of the announcements that came out last year. Let me jump forward. So if you remember last March and June, there were two warnings that came out. They generated a lot of media buzz. The Future of Life Institute published this statement: "We call on all AI labs to immediately pause for at least 6 months the training of AI systems more powerful than GPT-4." And everyone signed it, 33,000 people, Elon Musk and Sam Altman and all the big AI people signed it, but then nobody actually did anything about pausing their AI development. And then in June, the Center for AI Safety published this statement about, that the risk of extinction from AI was so high that it should be a global priority. And everyone jumped on that and signed it. And people talked about it for a few weeks, but nobody actually did anything, which, is kind of what you expect. But it sort of got me thinking at a point, like, how far back does this go? Because there are statements like this going back, like Stephen Hawking in 2014 was like, AI is going to eventually replace us all one day if it doesn't kill us. And there's statements like that going back. So I kind of just started like working backwards. And the idea of creating an artificial intelligence and artificial life has been around a very, very long time. And one of the first instances that I could find was ancient Greece, with the creation of Talos. Talos was built by Hephaestus, the blacksmith of the gods, at Zeus's order, to defend the island of Crete. And Talos was this bronze statue, and depending on the version, he was either around like 7 or 8 feet tall and made out of molten bronze. And he would come up and sort of hug you to death, and you'd like burst into flames. And then in other versions, he's very tall, like, hundreds of feet high, and he throws boulders. It's your ship if you're not supposed to be coming to Crete. And it's a statue. He's filled with ichor, this like substance that animates him and gives him life and the ability to make decisions. So he seems very much like this autonomous robot who's keeping watch over the island of Crete. And I couldn't help but think that early sailors on their first trip to Crete must have been like, "Hey, is this the place where like there's the giant bronze guy who throws rocks at you if the king doesn't want you to be there?" It's like, no. He's actually much shorter than that, but he's like made out of lava and he's gonna hug you to death. And it's like, well, maybe we should give that a pass. But anyway, the point of Talos is the idea of creating something that's like a person, but isn't a person, goes back a long, long way. And we're going to jump forward quite a ways now, to the 1600s, to Rene Descartes, who's one of the first people to sort of talk about the idea of the difference between machine intelligence and human intelligence. Before he did that, in 1629, Rene Descartes started writing Treatise on the World, and it was going to be his introduction to rationalism for the world and how we should approach science moving forward. But then in 1633, Galileo was condemned by the Italian Inquisition. And Descartes kind of put the brakes on and was like, I don't want to end up like that guy. So I'm going to pause for a minute. So he takes a few years and he reworks Treatise on the World into a series of essays that are slightly less inflammatory, he hopes, to the church. And he publishes these 4 essays. And one of those is geometry, which is sort of the foundation for Cartesian geometry, or what we call today analytic coordinate geometry. But also another of the essays is Discourse on the Method. And in that, his most famous statement, "Cogito ergo sum," I think, therefore I am, that's where that comes from. Although he wrote it in French, so it was really Je pense donc je suis, and hopefully I didn't butcher that. But it's remembered in its Latin form. But also in Discourse, he starts to talk about the difference between automatons and humans. Automatons were kind of a curiosity of the time. They were like little mechanical toys, basically, that, you know, had gears and pulleys and wheels, and some of them could do pretty impressive things, like very basic speech for a few words, or whistle a tune, or move around a little bit, or, you know, seemingly react to stimuli, but they were, you know, fairly basic little toys, if nothing else. And he also felt that animals were automatons, and that they were not capable of anything, not capable of sort of human thought and thinking were automatons. And in Descartes' mind, the mind was very separate from the body, and that no matter how you rearrange their organs, that was his, he writes about the disposition of their organs. No matter how you rearrange the organs of an animal, it's never going to be capable of human thought. And he applied that to the automatons that were little machines as well. No matter how you arrange the inner workings of any machine, it will never be capable of human thought. And so that was sort of the basis of this argument that we're going to see repeated over and over again through the years. A fun discussion on automatons. In 1770, Wolfgang von Kempelen built the Turk. The Turk was a chess-playing automaton, and he would tour it around and invite people to play chess against his automaton. And the game would begin, the challenger would come up, and Kempelen would open the machine up so everyone could see the inner workings of it and see the little gears and pulleys and all the little different things, and make sure that there was no person hiding in there, that it was not a, you know, not some sort of sham or fake, but that it was in fact a functional automaton. And it would then play the challenger in chess, and it was very good at chess. It defeated Benjamin Franklin, it defeated Napoleon. And actually Napoleon attempted to cheat. And when Napoleon made the illegal move, the Turk swiped its arm across the board, knocking all the pieces off. And in other instances of people attempting to cheat, sometimes it would bang its arm on the table, and other times it would swipe the pieces off the board. And so it continued to tour around. Kempelen died, someone else purchased it, and continued to tour it around. And eventually it made its way to the US, where Edgar Allan Poe happened to see it play in 1836. He wrote an article about it, calling it a hoax, saying that its moves were not machine-like enough to be a machine, but not human enough to be human, that there was some trickery obviously involved, which of course there was. There actually was a hidden compartment inside of which there was a chess master hidden. And over the years, there were 5 or 6 different chess masters who operated the Turk. But for many years, people were very fooled by it. But once Poe published his piece, people kind of just lost interest in it and quit paying attention. It eventually ended up in a museum and was burned in a fire and destroyed like mid to late 1800s. Moving forward to the early 1800s, we move out of automatons made of metal and wood and those things. And Mary Shelley offers us the idea of making an automaton out of human body parts. Frankenstein's alternate title is the modern Prometheus, Prometheus being the Titan from Greek mythology who steals fire from the sun and gives it to humans who, you know, he takes that which had previously belonged only to the gods and bestows it to humankind, which is sort of what Victor Frankenstein does. He unlocks the secret to animating something into something living. And in terms of AI, it sort of highlights the responsibility of the creator. The ambition of Victor Frankenstein weighed against the impact that his creature has on the world. if you haven't read Frankenstein, of course, things don't go very well for either himself or his monster. And so highlights the importance of ethics as well as unchecked scientific advancement, right? Like we need to have oversight in things that we develop. People don't just need to be out there building things without anyone looking over their shoulder. And we see this repeated towards the end of the 1800s with Wells with the Island of Dr. Moreau, where once again, we're making living automatons, but Moreau, like kind of worse than Frankenstein, is taking animals and transforming them surgically into like not quite people, but not quite animals. And that also goes very poorly. And it's, you know, this sort of fascination with mad science and scientists who were free of oversight and ethics, and kind of serves as a warning for, you know, the development and advancement of AI that people are worried threatens our existence today, in sort of these fun like monster tales. Moving forward and going back to the machines, late 1800s, Samuel Butler writes Darwin Among the Machines, and then he includes that later in his book Erewhon. And Butler is definitely considered a Luddite. He's in New Zealand, and he sort of writes this, it's kind of like, I'm sorry, Gulliver's Travels, where he is amongst this like machine society, but he's making parallels to how the machines are gaining upon humans and are eventually like going to replace humans. And he uses terms like the mechanical life and how they're evolving and eventually self-replicating, and just sort of creates this view where one day we're going to be replaced by the machines, which is something we'll see echoed a lot more as we move through time. Oscar Wilde publishes The Soul of Man Under Socialism, where he sort of takes the opposite view. He starts out talking about how people using machines, you know, in the industrial age is largely something to replace human labor, and how that's bad. You know, one man with a machine ends up taking the jobs of a bunch of other people, and this, he argues 500 here, and has therefore 500 times as much as he should. But then he envisions this future world where under proper conditions, machinery will serve man. Once everyone has a machine of their own, everyone will be able to sort of share in the glory of the machine world, and that eventually machines will do everything for us, and we'll be able to live lives of luxury, and we can explore the arts to our heart's content. And it's going to be wonderful and great. And so that's just a counter to what comes next, and sort of to before. E.M. Forster in 1909 publishes The Machine Stops. In The Machine Stops, there's this machine that controls every aspect of our lives. It handles feeding us. It handles like when it's daylight, when it's dark, like every aspect of our lives is controlled by the machine. And we eventually end up worshiping it. And in the story, everyone lives underground in a little like room by themselves, and humans never interact in person with other people, except to procreate in very rare instances. But most of the time we're just in these rooms, and we can Zoom call with our family and friends through like this screen, and we can access something like an internet to look at and think about and study old ideas, but we don't think about new ideas. So it's like we can watch YouTube videos and look at things on Wikipedia, and we can Zoom with each other, but that's the extent of our lives. And then the machine, as the title suggests, the machine stops, and that kind of ends up going pretty poorly for humanity. So this is sort of these continued warning against over reliance on machines and allowing them to, you know, like replace our humanity. A few years later, Karel Čapek, he's a Czechoslovakian playwright, publishes the play Rossum's Universal Robots. And this gives us the word robot for the first time. It's actually based on a Czech word, robota, which is the Czech word for forced labor. And in this in the play, the robots are organic. They're not like metal robots. They've got like metal components, but their bodies are like kind of like Frankensteinish. And this factory is turning out tons and tons of these robots, and they're doing all of the drudgery work, kind of like Oscar Wilde was postulating that we'd have these robots doing everything for us. But then the inventor alters a few of them to be able to like desire things and feel things. And this, of course, leads to a revolution where the robots kill all the people except for one, and the one person is trying to help the robots figure out how to like reproduce or develop new robots. And then in the end, he realizes that there are these two, a male and female robots, have fallen in love with each other, and he realizes that they are the new Adam and Eve, and that as the sun sets on his life, like the sun is rising on the robot world, which will replace humanity. Again, playing into the machines will replace us eventually theme. This leads and inspires Isaac Asimov, who writes the 3 Laws of Robotics in 1942. And the 3 laws, the human may not injure, or a robot may not injure a human being or allow a human to come to harm, obey the orders given it by human beings, except where they conflict with the first law. And then a robot must protect its own existence as long as that doesn't conflict with the first or second law. So it was like this hierarchy of laws that all of these robots in his stories had to obey. But then he writes stories about the robots that some of them are collected in the book I, Robot. And then he writes robot stories up through like the 1990s. And in a lot of cases, he's dreaming up ways that robots would circumvent these 3 laws, or ways in which people modify the 3 laws in ways that are bad. And it's, the idea of like, how are we going to have artificial intelligence, which Asimov described as a positronic brain. How would we sort of control that and keep the lid on the bottle and keep robots in their place and keep them from replacing us, so we don't end up with the revolution from Rossum's Universal Robots. Moving back out of fiction and into reality, Alan Turing, the famous codebreaker from World War II, published Computing Machinery and Intelligence in 1950. He argued that it was impossible to answer the question, can machines think, just because of the so many ways you can define the word machines and the word think. So he proposed the imitation game, which is what we call today the Turing test. In the imitation game, you would have an interrogator who had a person, or had 2 people in rooms, and the interrogator's job is to figure out which of the people is a man and which is a woman by asking them questions that the people respond to, through like a typewriter, so he can't hear their voices or see their handwriting. But then you replace one of those people with a machine, and the point at which the interrogator cannot discern who the machine is and who the person is, at that point, you would have a machine that has won the imitation game or passed the Turing test, and you have a machine that we cannot detect, as not being a machine, or not being human, excuse me. And this leads to a lot of philosophers wondering about this idea. And John Lucas, a few years later, published his Minds, Machines, and Gödel, which relies heavily on Gödel's incompleteness theorem. I am not a mathematician, and I'm not going to jump into that, other than to say that the crux of that argument was that the mind was something that could not be programmed in a machine, that humans with the ability to solve all the complexities of mathematics was something that a machine cannot do. John Searle kind of reproduces this many years later in 1980 with the Chinese room argument. The basis for that was that you have a room with John Searle in it. And people on the outside of the room are feeding pieces of paper with questions written in Chinese on them into the room. And inside the room, John Searle has a set of instructions for how to respond to questions that come through in Chinese. And so he goes through his manual and finds the appropriate response for the question, and then he writes that out based on what his rules tell him to do, and then he puts that in the output slot. And so to the person on the outside, it would seem that the machine on the inside understands Chinese, but in fact, it's just John Searle following a set of rules. And again, the argument being that a machine cannot understand something. It can simply follow rules or instructions, even very, very complex ones. And again, sort of building on Descartes' idea that no matter how we rearrange the organs or the pulleys and wheels, we're never going to be able to recreate human thought and consciousness. Now we're going to go into science fiction movies really quick. There are so many that we could cover. I can't do them all. I'm going to do 3 very quickly. And one I'm going to kind of brush to the side. 2001, A Space Odyssey, 1968. We are introduced to the HAL 9000 or HAL whatever. Anyway, HAL, the supercomputer, who is the AI that runs this spaceship on its exploration. And in a nutshell, sorry for the spoiler, HAL kind of goes crazy and kills some of the astronauts before getting shut down. While it's a cult classic and we all look back at it, as sort of like one of the great movie AI villains of all time, at the time, people weren't very impressed. It was a long, fairly slow-paced movie. And in the end, it's just a computer on a spaceship who kills 4 astronauts. And people are like, well, I'm not an astronaut. I don't really see, this isn't a huge problem to me. And it just kind of it doesn't really raise the public consciousness on AI much. But then in 1983 and 4, 2 movies come out which have a huge impact on public perception and even public domestic policy around future AI. And the first of those is War Games in 1983. And in War Games, Matthew Broderick, the future Ferris Bueller, is a bored high school student who is also a hacker. And he hacks into a company that he thinks is a video game company, but is actually a government NORAD site which is actually the War Operation Plan Response, WOPR. So it's WOPR. And WOPR is this computer that has been built because in war gaming, the government has decided that when the time comes that we have to launch nuclear missiles against the Soviet Union, humans are too likely to be afraid to do it, and they're not going to do it. So we need something that will make that decision for them and launch our missiles so that we don't all get destroyed by the Soviet Union. Ferris Bueller hacks in and starts a game of global thermonuclear war with WOPR, and WOPR starts sending alerts to the government, but it doesn't realize that this is that he's trying to play a game. So it's sending actual alerts. So the U.S. thinks it's about to be attacked by the Soviet Union, and this sort of situation builds, and eventually people figure out what's going on, and Ferris Bueller gets to he challenges WOPR to play tic-tac-toe against itself, at which point WOPR comes to the realization that it's sort of a no-win scenario because it keeps coming to a draw playing tic-tac-toe. And the conclusion that WOPR comes to is that the only way to win global thermonuclear war is not to play. And so crisis is averted. But the fascinating thing about the movie War Games is that Ronald Reagan actually watched the movie at Camp David the weekend that it came out. He's had a private screening of it, and he saw it, and he was fascinated by it. So the next week, he goes to the chairman of the Joint Chiefs of Staff and is like, hey, there's this movie, War Games, like, I want you to watch it. Tell me what you think. Like, is this something we need to worry about? And so they're like, well, Mr. President, it's a movie. Not really, but the president's like, I want you to look into this. So he goes and he looks into it, and he comes back a few weeks later, and the famous quote is, Mr. President, the problem is much worse than you think. And at that point, there just wasn't much in the way of cybersecurity and information security and that sort of thing. And clips from the movie are shown in congressional hearings, and like wildly, this is the birth of cybersecurity policy in the United States. So we have like Whopper and Ferris Bueller and President Reagan responsible for kicking off cybersecurity in the United States. And hopefully that's the craziest thing that I say today. The next year, Terminator comes out, which of course has a huge impact on public consciousness. It's a very popular movie. And again, like the government has handed control of nuclear missiles over to this AI or over to computer system, which then becomes self-aware, and then it nukes the world, and a war between humans and machines happens, and Arnold Schwarzenegger gets sent back in time to kill the future leader of the resistance's mom. And, you know, and then we have a whole series of movies like exploring this idea of a future AI that's going to try to kill us all. And suddenly people are very, I mean, no one's like seriously like, well, this is a problem we need to think about, but it really brings AI into the public consciousness in a way that had never been before. And I'm going to close out with Roger Penrose. Really, I could have included Penrose on the slide with Lucas and Searle, but he deserves his own slide simply for his accomplishments. He was the first person to mathematically prove that black holes are possible. I mean, they were theorized, of course, by Einstein, and people were pretty sure, but he was the first person to like get on paper, like, this is possible. And he also won the Nobel Prize for Physics many years later. But in 1989, he wrote a book called The Emperor's New Mind. And the basis of the argument was that consciousness cannot be computed, which is sort of building on that idea of Lucas's. And this becomes known as the Lucas-Penrose argument, you know, for that AI is never going to be at the level that we are at as humans. And this kind of, you know, continues. And I've even read articles that are arguing the same thing as recently as this year, but we kind of trace them all back. And where I end up is back at Descartes with this idea of that it all comes down to how we can organize and organize the organs inside this inside our automatons.